The hall of the Concord was built for silence. It was not quiet because no one spoke. It was quiet because every sound carried weight. The floor was smooth crystal stone, grown rather than carved. Light came from no visible source, soft and even, designed to calm species with eyes sensitive to glare. Delegates from more than 100 worlds sat or stood in positions shaped for their bodies, some breathing air, some mist, some nothing at all. At the center of it all stood the human delegation. Ambassador Elias Morgan kept his posture relaxed, hands folded behind his back. He had learned early that trying to look powerful among aliens who could crush steel or bend gravity was pointless. Calm worked better. Calm made people listen. Behind him, 2 advisors stood quietly, a cultural expert and a biologist. They had spent months preparing for this summit, rehearsing answers to thousands of possible questions. Trade, territory, technology, war, peace. None of them had prepared for this. Princess Zalthira rose from her seat. She was tall and elegant, her body long and segmented, covered in smooth plates that reflected light like polished pearl. Fine tendrils framed her face, shifting slightly as she focused. Her species, the Alari, were one of the founding members of the Concord. They lived for centuries. Their words carried history. When she spoke, the translation field rendered her voice clear and gentle. "Ambassador Morgan," she said, "may I ask a question about your species?" Elias inclined his head. "Of course, Your Highness." Her tendrils paused, a sign of careful thought. "Human records indicate that your average lifespan is less than 1/10 of my own," she said. "Your bodies are vulnerable to disease, injury, and environmental change. Yet your population growth has been significant." Around the hall, attention sharpened. Some delegates leaned forward. Others adjusted sensors or flared colors that meant curiosity. Zalthira continued. "My people reproduce once every 40 to 50 standard cycles. It is a rare and sacred act, carefully planned, emotionally controlled." She tilted her head slightly. "How often can humans mate?" The question landed like a dropped object in still water. The translation field did not soften it. It did not explain intent. It simply delivered the words. Elias did not react at first. Years of training held his face neutral, but behind his eyes thoughts raced. He glanced briefly at Dr. Lena Ortiz, the biologist. She met his eyes and gave a very small nod. "Answer honestly." Elias took a breath. "Biologically," he said, "humans are capable of reproduction far more frequently than most known species." A ripple moved through the hall. It was not sound. It was movement, color shifts, electromagnetic signals, chemical releases. Surprise, translated into 100 different forms. Princess Zalthira did not interrupt. She waited. Elias continued, choosing each word carefully. "There is no fixed cycle required for mating. Humans can reproduce year-round once maturity is reached." The silence deepened. Some delegates exchanged data instantly. Others pulled up human records they had clearly not studied closely enough. A few stared openly. Zalthira's tendrils curled inward, a sign of intense focus. "That frequency," she said slowly, "would be considered excessive by Concord standards." Elias nodded. "I understand why it might appear that way." "Appear?" she asked. "Yes," he said, "because capability and behavior are not the same thing." That earned him more attention. Zalthira studied him. "Explain." Elias shifted his weight slightly, grounding himself. "Humans evolved on a world that was unpredictable, dangerous. We lost people often, to weather, to animals, to illness, to conflict. Life was fragile." He gestured lightly, not to dramatize, but to illustrate. "Our biology adapted to ensure continuity. The ability to reproduce frequently meant that loss did not mean the end." A delegate from a silicon-based species emitted a low vibration. Data flowed. Zalthira said, "Yet unchecked reproduction leads to collapse, resource exhaustion, social instability." Yes, Elias agreed immediately, which is why humans developed social systems, cultural norms, and personal choices to regulate ourselves. That caused another stir. "You regulate yourselves?" asked a voice from the far side of the hall. Elias turned slightly. "Yes." Dr. Ortiz stepped forward, her voice calm. "Human reproduction is not driven purely by instinct. It is tied to emotion, consent, bonding, and responsibility. Most humans do not reproduce as often as they physically could." Princess Zalthira considered this. "So your people possess the ability for frequent reproduction, but choose restraint." "Correct," Elias said. Her tendrils slowly extended again. "That choice," she said, "is unusual." Elias smiled faintly. "Humans are used to being unusual." A few delegates made sounds that translated as amusement. Others did not. The princess turned her gaze inward, likely consulting private data streams. When she looked back, her tone was thoughtful, rather than accusatory. "If humans can reproduce so often," she asked, "why are your population numbers not exponentially higher?" Elias answered honestly. "Because raising a human child requires time, care, and emotional investment. Because we value quality of life. Because we mourn our dead and we plan for the future." He paused. "And because we learned, often the hard way, that survival without compassion isn't worth much." That line hung in the air. Zalthira did not respond immediately. Instead, she studied the human delegation as a whole. The way they stood, close but not rigid, alert but not aggressive. "You bond," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," Elias replied. "Deeply." Her tendrils shifted, this time in a pattern that signaled curiosity rather than caution. "My people bond rarely," she said, "because our lives are long. We are careful with attachment." Elias nodded. "Humans are not." That earned a few quiet reactions. The princess returned to her seat slowly, as if the motion itself required thought. The discussion moved on to other topics: trade corridors, shared research, border disputes, but the energy in the room had changed. Whispers followed the humans. Data packets flew. Assumptions were challenged. Later, during a recess, Elias stood near a wide window that looked out into open space. Stars drifted like scattered dust. He loosened his collar slightly. "That went better than expected," Dr. Ortiz said quietly. He exhaled. "Or worse. Hard to tell." Across the hall, he noticed several delegates watching them, not with hostility, with calculation. Princess Zalthira stood apart from her advisors, her posture still and composed, but her tendrils moved in slow, thoughtful patterns. She was not offended, she was thinking. And that, Elias knew, could be far more dangerous than anger. Because somewhere in the Concord's vast network of minds, a new idea was forming. Humans were not fragile because they lived briefly. They were something else entirely, and the galaxy had just begun to realize it. The recess ended, but the question did not. When the delegates returned to the hall, the space felt smaller, as if the walls themselves had leaned in to listen. The crystal floor reflected more movement than before. Data streams flowed openly now, no longer hidden behind polite delays. The humans could feel it without anyone saying a word. They were being measured. Ambassador Elias Morgan stood in his place again, calm on the outside, alert on the inside. He had been in tense negotiations before, but this was different. This was not about territory or trade. This was about identity. Across the hall, several Concord representatives had already begun quiet side discussions. Colors shifted. Low vibrations passed between seats. A few species communicated entirely through data bursts that flickered like brief stars. Princess Zalthira watched it all. She said nothing at first. Her stillness was noticeable. Among her people, silence during debate meant careful thought, not indecision. Her advisors waited, trusting her instincts. The next speaker was not hostile, but his tone was sharp. "We request clarification," said a delegate from a species known for strict population control. "If humans possess such reproductive capacity, what prevents uncontrolled expansion beyond your home system?" Elias had expected this. "Our history," he said, "and our choices." "That is not a measurable safeguard," the delegate replied. "Intent changes. Circumstances change." "Yes," Elias agreed, "which is why we build systems that adapt." Dr. Ortiz stepped forward again. "Human societies have laws, education, healthcare, and cultural values that encourage responsibility. When resources are limited, we adjust. When conditions improve, we plan." Another delegate spoke, this one more blunt. "You are saying you trust yourselves?" "Yes," Elias said simply. A low murmur passed through the hall. Trusting oneself was not common among Concord species. Most relied on biological limits or strict external controls. The idea that a species could restrain itself by choice alone was unsettling. Princess Zalthira finally rose. "Ambassador Morgan," she said, "your answers suggest that humans rely heavily on emotion." "Yes," Elias said, "we do." "In the Concord," she continued, "emotion is often viewed as a destabilizing force." Elias did not argue. "For humans, it is also a stabilizing one." She tilted her head. "Explain." He chose his words carefully. "Emotion creates bonds. Bonds create responsibility. Responsibility creates restraint." Some delegates reacted with skepticism. Others recorded the statement for later analysis. Zalthira considered it. "Your argument depends on the assumption that empathy will always outweigh ambition." "No," Elias said. "Only that it often does, and when it doesn't, we learn. Sometimes painfully." That honesty caused another ripple. During a pause in discussion, Princess Zalthira requested a private session with the human delegation. The request was granted quickly. Curiosity outweighed caution. The private chamber was smaller, designed for diplomacy rather than display. The light was warmer. The walls absorbed sound. Zalthira faced Elias directly. "I have reviewed your historical data," she said. "Your species has experienced numerous periods of conflict." "Yes," he said quietly. "You have destroyed your own cities, poisoned parts of your world, nearly ended yourselves more than once." "Yes." Her tendrils shifted. "Yet you are here." "We are," Elias said. "Why?" she asked. He did not answer immediately. He thought of wars, of recovery, of rebuilding from ruins. "Because humans don't stop," he said. "We fail, we fall, but we continue." Dr. Ortiz added softly, "And because we care, even when it hurts." Zalthira studied them for a long moment. "My people avoid pain," she said. "We design our lives to minimize it." Elias nodded. "Humans don't have that luxury. Pain taught us how to survive." The princess returned to the main hall with more questions than answers. The Concord resumed debate, but the tone had shifted again. Fear was creeping in, subtle but present. If humans could reproduce often, adapt quickly, and rebuild after devastation, what would they become in 1,000 years? In 10,000, some delegates saw partners. Others saw a risk. A proposal was quietly introduced by a coalition of cautious species. It was not framed as punishment. It was framed as protection. "Provisional limitations on human expansion," the proposal read, "to ensure long-term galactic stability." Elias read the summary with a steady face, but his jaw tightened. Limits on colonization, mandatory oversight, reproductive monitoring on shared worlds. Not hostile, but not trust either. When discussion resumed, voices grew firmer, questions sharper. How can we be sure humans will not overwhelm fragile systems? What guarantees can you provide? Why should the Concord take this risk? Elias answered each question calmly, but he could feel the tide shifting. Princess Zalthira listened more than she spoke. She noticed something the others did not. The humans did not deny their potential. They did not claim perfection. They acknowledged their capacity for harm openly, and yet they stood there without fear, without threats, without begging. That was unusual. During another break, Zalthira requested access to human social records. Not population charts or genetic data, but personal histories, families, communities, stories. She reviewed accounts of humans caring for sick children with no guarantee of survival, of rebuilding homes after disasters, of choosing not to have children because they wanted to give existing ones better lives. She saw grief. She saw restraint. She saw love expressed not as ceremony, but as daily effort. Back in the hall, debate reached a peak. One delegate spoke plainly. Humans are dangerous not because of what they do now, but because of what they could do. Silence followed. Elias met the speaker's gaze. That's true of every intelligent species here. Yes, the delegate replied, but most of us are limited by nature. You are not. Princess Zalthira rose again, slowly. Nature limited humans, she said. It simply did not limit them in the ways we expected. All eyes turned to her. She continued. We assumed fragility meant weakness. Short lives meant recklessness. High reproduction meant excess. Her tendrils moved in a thoughtful pattern. But what I see is a species shaped by loss choosing care. The hall grew quiet. The question, she said, is not how often humans can mate. She looked directly at Elias. It is whether we judge them by their biology or by their behavior. The proposal was not withdrawn, but it was no longer certain. As the session ended for the cycle, Elias felt the weight of what lay ahead. Humanity was not being attacked. It was being tested, and somewhere in the minds of the conquered, a new realization was taking shape. Humans were not a problem to be controlled. They were a variable, and variables could change everything. The Concord did not vote immediately. That alone told Elias Morgan everything he needed to know. When a decision was clear, the Concord acted fast. When it hesitated, it meant fear and curiosity were fighting for control. Part 3 began in that uneasy space, where nothing was decided and everything mattered. The humans were asked to remain aboard the station, not detained, not restricted, but observed. Elias understood the language of diplomacy well enough to hear what was not being said. Humanity was under review. Princess Zalthira requested continued access to human experts, this time not only scientists and diplomats, but historians, psychologists, and sociologists. She wanted context, not numbers. The first meeting took place in a smaller chamber overlooking a living star field. No guards, no formal seating, just conversation. Your people survived repeated collapse events, Zalthira said calmly. Plagues, wars, environmental damage. Many species would not have recovered even once. Elias nodded. Some of us didn't. She turned her gaze to him. Yet you rebuilt. Yes. Why? He thought for a moment. Because humans don't see survival as an individual act. We see it as something shared. Dr. Ortiz added. Even when societies break, small groups hold on. Families, friends, communities. They carry knowledge forward. Zalthira processed this. Your records show that humans often form emotional bonds even when separation or loss is likely. Yes, Elias said softly. We know things end. That doesn't stop us. That answer stayed with her. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the Concord, the debate continued. Some delegates pushed harder for restrictions. They argued that humanity's adaptability, combined with reproductive capability, could reshape entire regions of space within a few centuries. That kind of change frightened species that evolved slowly. Others countered that humanity had shown restraint so far, that it had followed conquered law, that it had helped neighboring systems without demand. The turning point came unexpectedly. An emergency signal broke into the Concord network. A nearby member system had suffered a catastrophic failure. A chain reaction in its star's magnetic field had stripped a habitable world of atmosphere within hours. Evacuation had been partial. Millions remained stranded. The species affected was old, very old. Their reproduction cycles were slow. Their population had been stable for thousands of years. Now, it faced collapse. The Concord moved to respond, but coordination was slow. Many species required specialized environments. Others could not risk exposure. Time passed. Lives were ticking away. Elias did not wait for permission. He requested the floor. "Humanity offers immediate assistance," he said. "Evacuation vessels, medical teams, temporary habitats. We can deploy within hours." A delegate objected. "Your ships are not certified for—" "We will adapt them," Elias said. "We always do." Princess Zalthira watched closely. Within hours, human ships launched. Cargo vessels converted to shelters. Medical bays reconfigured. Crews volunteered without hesitation. Families volunteered too. Not soldiers, not officials. Families. Humans who were willing to relocate to a damaged system to stabilize it long term. To help rebuild ecosystems. To stay for generations if needed. The Concord observed in real time. They saw humans work without ceremony. No speeches, no claims of honor, just action. They saw human medics treat alien physiology they had studied only in theory, adjusting on the fly. They saw engineers redesign atmospheric processors mid-flight. They saw parents calming alien children with gestures and tones that crossed species barriers. Princess Zalthira accessed live feeds. She saw something that statistics had never shown her. Human reproduction was not just about creating life, it was about maintaining it. Days later, when the immediate crisis stabilized, the Concord reconvened. The mood had changed again, not fear. Awe mixed with uncertainty. One delegate spoke quietly. "The humans did not need to help." Another replied, "They did not ask permission." Elias stood when requested. "We helped because it was needed," he said, "not because it benefited us." "Your people will expend resources for worlds that are not yours?" a delegate asked. "Yes." "Even if it limits your own expansion?" "Yes." Princess Zalthira rose slowly. "I have reviewed human family structures," she said. "They are not efficient by Concord standards. They are emotionally complex, resource-intensive." She paused. "Yet they persist." She turned to face the assembly. "Humans do not treat reproduction as a mechanism of dominance. They treat it as continuity, as care, as legacy." The hall was silent. "They can reproduce often," she continued, "but they do not see life as disposable. Each child represents effort, sacrifice, and hope." Her tendrils stilled. "That is not excess. That is resilience." Some delegates shifted uneasily. Others nodded. The proposal for restrictions was still on the table, but it felt different now, less certain, less justified. Elias met Zalthira's gaze. For the first time since the question had been asked, he sensed something other than judgment. Respect. But respect did not mean acceptance, not yet. The Concord requested one final clarification before moving forward. "What happens?" a delegate asked. "When humans face loss they cannot overcome?" Elias answered honestly. "We grieve," he said. "We remember, and then we try again." Silence followed. The Concord adjourned for deliberation. Princess Xalthira remained seated long after others left. She reviewed the data once more. Not charts, not projections, stories. Humans who rebuilt cities on ruins, humans who adopted orphaned children from other species, humans who chose to stay behind on dying worlds so others could escape. She finally understood the answer she had not known she was seeking. Humans did not survive because they could create life often. They survived because they refused to let life be meaningless. And the Concord was not yet ready to decide what that meant. Part 3 ended not with resolution, but with something far more powerful. The galaxy was no longer asking how often humans could mate. It was asking what kind of future humans were capable of building. The conquered chamber felt different when everyone returned. Not calmer, heavier. The emergency had changed the way the delegates looked at the humans. Before, humanity had been a question mark. Now it was a force that had acted without being told to. That made some feel safer. It made others nervous. Ambassador Elias Morgan stood with the human delegation once more. His posture was steady, but his thoughts were not. He knew Part 4 was the most dangerous stage. Not open rejection, not acceptance, judgment. The chair being of the conquered spoke first, its voice layered with harmonic tones. The emergency response conducted by the human delegation has been reviewed, it said. Effectiveness is confirmed. Impact is insignificant. A pause followed. However, it continued, this action raises new concerns. Elias expected that. A delegate from a long-lived species spoke. Humans intervened without full Concord authorization. Yes, Elias said. Lives were at risk. You assumed responsibility for an entire system, the delegate replied. That level of initiative can destabilize established order. Elias did not argue. So can inaction. The room stirred. Princess Xalthira observed quietly. She had not spoken since the emergency ended. Her people believed that words mattered most when used sparingly. Another delegate spoke, sharper this time. Humans adapt too quickly. You rebuild too fast. You form populations that integrate instead of remaining separate. That can erase cultures, Dr. Ortiz responded calmly. We do not erase cultures. We learn them. And if your presence changes them, the delegate pressed. Change happens with or without us, Elias said. We just choose to help shape it with care. That word again, care. To some species it sounded weak. To others it sounded dangerous. The Concord requested testimony from the affected system. A representative appeared via projection. Their species was fragile, slow reproducing, and deeply ceremonial. Their voice trembled as they spoke. If not for the humans, the representative said, our children would not be alive. They stayed. They taught us how to adapt machines we never imagined changing. They did not demand control. The projection faded. Silence followed. Then the hardest question came. A delegate asked Princess Xalthira directly, You initiated the inquiry that led to this discussion. Based on what you have seen, do you believe humans should be limited? All eyes turned to her. She rose slowly. When I asked my question, she said, I believed biology defined destiny. Her tendrils moved in a slow, thoughtful pattern. My people believe that long life demands restraint, that rarity gives meaning. She looked at Elias. Humans are different. The room listened. They live briefly, she continued, so they attach meaning quickly. They love deeply, knowing it may hurt. They create life knowing they may not see its end. She paused. That is not recklessness. That is courage. A ripple of reaction spread through the chamber. But, she added, courage without wisdom is destruction. The delegates leaned forward. So the question is not whether humans should be limited, she said. It is whether they can be trusted to limit themselves. All eyes turned back to Elias. He did not rush his answer. Humans fail, he said plainly, We make mistakes, sometimes terrible ones. He met the room's gaze. But every system you fear us overwhelming, we once overwhelmed our own world. And we learned, slowly, painfully, but we learned. He gestured slightly. We are here because we chose to change. A delegate asked, "And if you fail again?" Elias answered without hesitation. "Then we will face the consequences, like we always have." That honesty unsettled many. The Concord withdrew to deliberate. Hours passed. The humans waited, not in isolation, not in fear. They spoke quietly among themselves, shared food, reviewed reports from the relief effort, still ongoing. Princess Xalthira watched them through observation channels. She noticed something small. The humans checked on each other, not status, not performance. "How are you holding up? Did you rest? Any word from home?" She compared that to her own people, who prized emotional control above all else, who rarely asked such questions. The Concord returned. The decision was not absolute. It never was. The Concord will not impose reproductive or expansion restrictions on humanity, the chair being announced. A wave of reaction passed through the hall. However, it continued, humanity will be designated a steward species. Elias frowned slightly. Clarify. You will be expected to assist in crisis response, the chair being said, to aid vulnerable systems, to share adaptive strategies. Your growth will be observed, not constrained. A test, not a cage. Princess Xalthira stepped closer to Elias. You will be watched, she said quietly. He nodded. We always are. She studied him for a moment, then said something unexpected. My people once believed survival was about preserving ourselves. She looked toward the stars. Humans believe survival is about preserving each other. Elias said nothing. The Concord session ended. But the story was not over. As human ships continued to aid damaged worlds, rumors spread. Stories followed. Humans who stayed behind on failing planets to guide rebuilding. Humans who chose adoption over reproduction. Humans who raised alien children alongside their own. Other species began requesting human advisors, not commanders, teachers. Princess Xalthira returned to her quarters, her thoughts heavy but clear. She finally understood the answer to her question. Humans could mate often, but more importantly, they could endure loss, change, and responsibility again and again without giving up. That was not something biology alone could explain. And the galaxy was about to change because of it. The Concord station slowly returned to its normal rhythm, but nothing was truly normal anymore. The decision had been made. Humanity was no longer just another young species asking for space among the stars. It had been given a role, a quiet title that carried heavy meaning. Steward species. Ambassador Elias Morgan felt the weight of it as he stood near the wide observation window once more. Stars drifted past, distant and calm, unaware of the choices being made below. Humanity had not been restricted, but it had not been fully embraced either. It had been trusted. That trust was fragile. Human ships continued their work across nearby systems. They did not fly banners or broadcast achievements. They simply arrived, helped, and stayed long enough to make sure things would hold after they left. Some stayed longer. On the damaged world that had started it all, human families lived inside temporary habitats alongside the native population. The air processors hummed day and night. Gardens grew under artificial light. Children of different species played together, learning each other's sounds before learning words. Observers from the Concord visited often. They watched humans teach without command, work without orders, share without keeping score. They also watched humans struggle. Humans grew tired. They argued. They made mistakes. Machines failed. Plans changed. and still they continued. Princess Xalthira followed these reports closely, more closely than she let anyone know. She had returned to her homeworld briefly, but her thoughts never left the stars. Her people asked her what she had learned from the humans. At first, she did not know how to answer, so she asked for one last private meeting with Ambassador Morgan before the humans were formally recognized as stewards. They met in a quiet chamber far from the grand halls. No advisors, no recorders, just two beings shaped by very different histories. "You never denied your weaknesses," Xalthira said. "That confused many of us." Elias smiled faintly. "We learned that pretending not to have them only makes things worse." She studied him. "When I asked my question, I expected fear, embarrassment, perhaps offense. And instead," he asked. "Instead you answered calmly," she said, "as if the question itself did not define you." "It didn't," Elias replied. "Not really." She was silent for a moment. "My people believe rarity gives life meaning," she said, "that because we reproduce rarely, each life is precious." Elias nodded. "That makes sense." "But humans," she continued, "can create life often, and yet you treat it as precious too, sometimes more so." She looked directly at him. "Why?" Elias thought of long nights, of small hands gripping fingers, of loss that never truly faded. "Because we know how easy it is to lose," he said, "and because every life is a chance to do better than before." Xalthira's tendrils moved slowly. "You create life knowing it may suffer." "Yes," Elias said quietly, "but also knowing it may love, learn, and change the world in ways we can't predict." She absorbed that. The final Concord assembly was held days later. This time the atmosphere was not tense, it was reflective. The chair being spoke, its voice steady. "Humanity has demonstrated adaptive capacity, restraint through choice, and commitment to shared survival." It paused. "Princess Xalthira has requested to address the assembly one final time." She rose. "When I asked how often humans could mate," she said, "I believed I was asking about numbers." A soft ripple of attention moved through the hall. "I believed biology would explain behavior," she continued. "That limits created wisdom." She turned, her gaze sweeping across the delegates. "I was wrong." The hall was silent. "Humans are not defined by how often they can create life," she said. "They are defined by what they do with it." She gestured toward the projection showing rebuilt habitats, shared schools, mixed species communities. "They do not endure because they are strong," she said. "They endure because they refuse to let others face the future alone." She faced Elias. "That is the answer I did not expect." The Concord ratified humanity's role unanimously. Not because humanity was perfect, but because it was willing to be responsible. Years passed. The title of steward species became less a label and more a habit. Humans were called when systems faltered, when populations struggled to adapt, when hope was thin. They did not solve every problem. They did not always succeed, but they stayed. Human children grew up hearing stories not only of Earth, but of distant worlds where their parents had helped rebuild rivers, skies, and societies. Some chose to travel those paths again. Others chose quieter lives. Both choices were respected. Princess Xalthira lived long enough to see generations of humans come and go. She watched them change, improve, stumble, and try again. She once recorded a personal reflection, archived quietly among her people's records. "Humans live briefly," she said in the recording, "so they learn to make every connection matter. They do not fear creating life because they believe in the future enough to risk it." She paused. "They asked the stars for a place to belong, and then they made room for everyone else." The galaxy changed slowly after that. Not through conquest, not through dominance, but through presence. And whenever someone asked how humanity had earned such trust, the answer was simple: Not because of how often humans could mate, but because, time and time again, they chose to care.